Do you remember your first time? No doubt it was fun, surprising, maybe a little awkward. It probably even got a little deeper than you expected.
Huh? Jim?
It's not what it looks like.
Of course, we're talking about your first time seeing Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the quintessential 80s movie about the high school experience, with all its wonderful highs and tragic lows. On the surface, a frivolous teen comedy about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, Fast Times is frequently insightful, surprisingly brave, and even occasionally touching. Oh yeah, and it managed to launch the careers of about a dozen household names in front of and behind the camera. So how did this joint get rolled? Grab your buds and let's party as we look at just what the happened to this movie. For a movie revolving around immature teenagers growing up way too fast, it's fitting that the person responsible was also a teenager who grew up rather fast. That would be a young writer and journalist named Cameron Crowe, who by his mid-teens was writing pieces for the likes of Rolling Stone magazine and interviewing legends in the music business.
And you can tell Rolling Stone magazine that my last words were, I'm on drugs!
Anyone who's seen Almost Famous knows that the precocious young man grew up having experiences well beyond his years, during a period when most kids are still having their mom cook dinner for them. Crowe himself missed much of the high school experience, having graduated at the shocking age of 15. And by the time he was 22, his book agent suggested the idea of going back to high school undercover to learn what was going on with the youth of the day.
First name first, last name last.
Maxwell.
Maxwell what?
Hauser.
Last school attended.
Cornell. High school.
Yes, Cameron Crowe lived a real-life 21 Jump Street, just without the cop stuff. After spending his quote-unquote senior year posing as a transfer student at Claremont High in San Diego, California, Crowe wrote the book Fast Times at Ridgemont High, based on actual events and conversations he had observed, changing the names to protect the innocent and not so innocent. Naturally, the book received a lot of press once it was revealed what Crowe had pulled off, and with any successful book inevitably comes a movie adaptation. Universal Pictures, which had struck gold a few years prior with Animal House, saw the potential for another raunchy teen comedy and sent producer Art Linson to help Crowe with the screenplay. Coincidentally, Linson had previously met Crowe back when the writer was doing a profile on one of their movies when he was 17, so the two already knew each other. Not everyone was so enthused, however. Linson received a memo from some higher-ups at Universal who were concerned that the movie was going to be a little too dark, a little too serious.
Did you see the memo about this?
Did you get that memo?
Yeah, I got the memo.
Yeah.
Didn't you get that memo?
I have the memo. And I'll go ahead and make sure you get another copy of that memo. Okay?
Yeah.
After all, this wasn't quite the same tone as Animal House. These teens did get up to wacky shenanigans, but there was also abortion, uncomfortable sex, and lots of casual drug use. Obviously, the studio ultimately moved forward with it, but they gave the film a relatively small budget in the neighborhood of $5 million in order to calm the fears of shareholders.
He's gonna kill us! He's gonna kill us! He's gonna kill you and he's gonna kill me, he's gonna kill us!
Relax. All right?
Hiring a director was next, and you might never believe who got the offer first. None other than David Lynch. Yes, the man who at that point had made Eraserhead and The Elephant Man. Can you picture David Lynch's Fast Times at Ridgemont High? Neither could he, and he promptly turned down the project. Art Linson then had an inspired idea. He had been enamored with a short film called Getting It Over With, made by a young New York director named Amy Heckerling. The short, fittingly enough, was about a girl determined to lose her virginity before turning 20, and it had made the rounds in Hollywood, impressing executives who wanted to work with young talent. Linson gave Heckerling the Fast Times book, and she fell in love with it, relating to its themes of kids who are trying too hard to be grown-ups, and she agreed it would make a compelling film. Heckerling and Crowe went through his book and cherry-picked what would make it into the screenplay. They came up with a script that stayed true to the book, but embellished it with some additional material from their own lives. And then the movie was ready to find its cast, and its cast, naturally, would end up being crucial to the final movie's legacy. According to Heckerling, they auditioned just about every up-and-comer in Hollywood. While there were some recognizable names in the mix, the director felt it was important to cast the film with mostly unknowns, all the better to sell the authenticity of the movie. Actors like Ralph Macchio, Matthew Broderick, Tom Hanks, Scott Baio, and Jodie Foster, just to name a few, were all considered. For the part of the ostensible lead, the perpetually stoned Jeff Spicoli, Anthony Edwards and Eric Stoltz were in the running, but it was the intensity of young Sean Penn that captured Heckerling's imagination. To hear her tell it, other actors had actually auditioned better for the part, but she was so convinced Penn was the right man that she went with her gut and hired him. We can probably all agree that was the right move. As a sort of consolation prize, Edwards and Stoltz would play Spicoli's equally stoned buds, and legend has it the three were involved in some method acting between takes. The pivotal roles of brother-sister duo Brad and Stacy Hamilton would go to Judge Reinhold and Jennifer Jason Leigh. Heckerling liked Jennifer because she genuinely looked like a kid who was in over her head, and the director thought the audience would respond sympathetically to all the hardships she endures because she really looked about 15. An early frontrunner for the Brad role was Nicolas Cage, then known as Nicholas Coppola, who apparently auditioned for the role about 10 times. Heckerling thought Nick's intensity was just a bit too dark for Brad. Who she thought should be bright and cheerful, at least initially, and since Jennifer Jason Leigh was also bringing a kind of despondent aura to the role of Stacy, Heckerling did not want both siblings to share that same brooding vibe. Nick did get a very minor role as one of Brad's pals, but in an interview years later, he admitted the experience was not a great one for him, saying he was surrounded by young actors who were not particularly open to the idea of working with a kid named Coppola. Cage claimed that people would hang around outside his trailer, quoting lines from his uncle's Apocalypse Now to razz him. That experience prompted him to change his last name from Coppola to Cage, believing he'd be treated more fairly without such a recognizable Hollywood royalty brand. 1 year after Fast Times, Nicolas Cage starred in Valley Girl, and the rest is history. To play Linda Bennett, the girl who thinks she knows it all, Heckerling was persuaded to cast Phoebe Cates by producer Art Linson, who was a big fan of hers. Cates was a model who was just getting into acting and had recently starred in a Blue Lagoon ripoff called Paradise. Cates was suitable for Linda because she could exude a worldliness while still looking childlike, perfect for the character who talks a big game but is much more immature than she lets on. Heckerling had a difficult time finding the right person for the part of Mark Ratner, the lovesick geek who pines for Stacy. Heckerling says it's the role she related to the most, so she felt it was important to get just right. Not having luck in LA, the casting department went to New York, where they saw a theater performance of Woody Allen's The Floating Light Bulb, and were subsequently impressed by the performance of Brian Backer, who won a Tony Award for his work.
The Tony for Outstanding Performance goes to Brian Backer in The Floating Light Bulb.
Wow.
Backer auditioned and nabbed the role of Ratner, which was based on Andy Rathbone, who went on to become the author of several For Dummies books, so it seems safe to say the Rat is doing just fine. To play Ratner's smooth-talking scalper friend Mike Damone, East Coast actor Robert Romanus was cast. Romanus played Mike as if he was a transfer student from New Jersey, giving a streetwise cool that was a noticeable deviation from the very Californian vibes of the rest of the cast. Other smaller roles were filled by Kelly Maroney, who would go on to Night of the Comet and Chopping Mall, familiar character actor Vincent Schiavelli, and future Oscar winner Forrest Whitaker. The movie's last crucial role was Mr. Hand, the no-nonsense history teacher who repeatedly clashes with Spicoli. The movie's only critical part for an adult, the role of Mr. Hand had to be filled by someone the audience would recognize as a believable authority figure. The filmmakers first went to Fred Gwynne of the Munsters fame, but the actor was turned off by the material and did not want to be involved with such a thing. Heckerling was a fan of screen veteran Ray Walston, who was famous for his role in the sitcom My Favorite Martian, but was also an accomplished stage and film actor. Walston had no qualms with the script and agreed to the part. Quite fittingly, Walston and Penn allegedly did not always get along. During their iconic first meeting, where Mr. Hand rips up Spicoli's class schedule card, Penn called him a red-faced motherfucker, deviating from the script as he would often do. Walston went to Heckerling and complained, asking her to tone down the actor's theatrics and get him to stay on script. Years later, Walston admitted he was a little afraid of Penn during their initial scenes together. Rather than toning it down, however, Penn leaned into it and usually remained in character, putting the name Jeff Spicoli on his dressing room and even changing his answering machine message to one left by the stoned surfer. People on set could not call him by his real name, and he would often play mind games with his co-stars, who would marvel at his commitment to the role. He went so far as to intentionally irritate his eyes to better help sell the facade of being stoned out of his mind. One day, Cameron Crowe, who was always on set, had brought his parents to the studio where they were shooting the final scene between Spicoli and Mr. Hand. During a break, Penn asked Crowe if he had brought any outsiders to the set. That stunned Crowe, who had kept his parents well out of sight. When he asked Penn how he knew, the actor simply replied, "I felt them." Penn later admitted he based Spicoli on a friend from his youth, and growing up in the Southern California beach community made it easy for him to relate to this character. Shooting on Fast Times went for 5 weeks in and around the Los Angeles area. The mall scenes were shot in Sherman Oaks and had to be done overnight after business hours, so those scenes with all of the necessary extras were filmed between 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. Heckerling would later admit that she had no idea what she was doing on her feature directing debut, but she was driven by the fear that she might never get another job unless she made a successful picture. What also helped was the fact that Universal was not particularly interested in her little movie because they were distracted by the Burt Reynolds Dolly Parton film The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, which was a major production for the studio and the one that had their attention. That said, at one point, Universal supposedly assigned Animal House director John Landis to investigate whether things were going according to plan with Heckerling's efforts. Landis had nothing negative to report and suggested that the studio leave them alone, and production on Fast Times proceeded without interference. We probably have to give some attention to that scene. You know the one that likely wore out plenty of VHS cassettes in the 80s and 90s from pausing and rewinding. It was only the second day of shooting, and a skeleton crew was used in order to make Phoebe Cates feel more comfortable with the revelation. Cates was particularly concerned that people in the neighboring houses would be watching, although Heckerling pointed out that the movie would eventually be released in hundreds of theaters, where thousands and thousands of eyes would be gazing upon her. Incidentally, the house where the scene was shot belonged to an old couple who had no idea what was being filmed at their pool. As for the moment when Cates interrupts Reinhold entertaining himself, her embarrassed reaction is genuine. Reinhold was actually stroking a very large dildo just below the camera frame, which provoked the intended reaction from Cates. For years after the movie's release, people who recognized Reinhold in public would make jerk-off gestures to him. It's gotta be tough when that's the thing you're most famous for. When the film was complete and Universal got a look at the final cut, they were not thrilled.
I'd like my money back.
Okay, I believe you have to fill out a form for that.
No, I'd like my money back now.
Executives thought it was too real and called it sexual but not sexy. The studio found that instead of another R-rated farce like Animal House or Porky's, Fast Times was dealing with adult issues in a very blunt manner. It didn't help that the movie initially received an X rating from the MPAA thanks to full frontal nudity of Mike Damone when he's with Stacy. The shot was cropped in order to keep his privates out of frame, which Heckerling always resented. The studio's confidence in the film was so minimal that they substantially reduced the theater count and even considered canceling a release on the East Coast as they were afraid it would only appeal to a limited West Coast audience. Universal released Fast Times at Ridgemont High on August 13, 1982, in nearly 500 theaters with very little advertising, and it debuted with $2.5 million in the number 7 spot. Seeing some potential, the studio added 100 theaters the following week and eventually got it onto more than 700 screens by Labor Day weekend, where the movie shot up to 3rd place. It topped out domestically with $27 million, not bad for a movie that only cost $5 million, and had very little faith or support from its studio. Of course, home video and cable is where the legend of Fast Times really grew, as it became one of the most significant comedies of its time. Just not quite popular enough to support a television spin-off, as without the return of the movie's cast, aside from Walston and Schiavelli, the 1986 Fast Times TV series lasted a mere 7 episodes. But today, we have Fast Times at Ridgemont High to thank for launching the careers of many talented people, some of them now multiple award winners. Undoubtedly one of the most quotable movies of all time.
Oh, gnarly!
It's pretty much the gold standard for high school comedies, along with Clueless, which just so happens to be another movie by Amy Heckerling. As much as we'd probably love to see David Lynch's Fast Times at Ridgemont High just out of morbid curiosity, we think it's safe to say the right person was hired for the job.